quiet and was listening intently. And as I was. One of the things that I spent a lot of time in my studies until I was 40 was in the philosophy of religion, where a very popular way of treating religion is that science covers the physical and material world, and religion covers, I don't know, our values, our emotions, ways of practicing the golden rule. It's just a completely separate thing. And in my own studies over years, I felt like I needed an integration of science and spirit. Science tells me much of what I know about the world. And if religion isn't dealing with what I know about the world, then I feel like it's just a consolation prize to say it's a nice thing to do on the side. So I was excited to see someone who was really an early adopter of the embracing of science and spirit together, at least in the Jewish world. My honor to present Rabbi Artson on the topic.
Shabbat Shalom. I have one unrelated thing to start with, which is I know that you've been dealing for years with the protest people outside, and you're wondering why they're here. And I can tell you why. Because when I got out of the B&B this morning, I turned in the wrong direction. And I walked for about 10 minutes thinking, this doesn't look right. I don't think this is right. And then I turned around and I saw in the distance two guys standing on the corner. And I knew it was a sign from God that that's where the synagogue was. So I think you should think of them as the welcoming committee, because I would still be wandering the streets if it were not for those guys. And I did wish them Shabbat Shalom as I walked by. On to a different topic. Okay, seriously, Eza Chutzpah, but that's a different conversation. From the time I was a kid, I was fascinated by science, which I knew I was allowed to be. And I also had apparently these inclinations about religion, which I was not allowed to be. The household I grew up in was a strictly atheist household. We identified as Jewish, but we were not observant in any traditional way. So very Jewish, very committed to many Jewish values, but not at all to traditional practice. On Yom Kippur, I went to school, ate the treif meal there, and then came home and we went to my aunt's house to break the fast with more treif. But I want to tell you two stories that reveal why this has been so deep in my life. First of which I've not revealed in public. So this is new and it's because I trust you. When I was about 9 or 10, I got very interested in Greek mythology. And I read voraciously there are tons of kids' books and early teen books on all the stories of the Greek myths. And I decided to give it a try. So I got from my mother one of those, you remember how they used to have those big Folgers coffee cans, And so I took one of those empty Folgers coffee cans and I filled it halfway with dirt and I sacrificed a Hebrew national hot dog to Zeus. I'm assuming you're not laughing at my religious practice. I don't know if my mother was horrified because I was worshiping a supernatural being, or if I was practicing something pagan. I don't think that's what got her goat, or that I wasted a perfectly fine hot dog. That may have bothered her. But I look back on that and I think, okay, there's a kid who doesn't know that he's religious. Right? I didn't have anyone to tell me, here's a way to do that today. You might want to try the 20th century. So I was doing what the books talked about. I tried, and I will tell you, I got nothing, like not an answer, not a response, nothing. So I haven't sacrificed to Zeus since. Just want to put that on the record. The other thing, I was really interested in science. So when I was in 9th grade, my father was kind enough to go to the Scripps Oceanography Institute in Monterey and talk to a doctoral student there who was studying octopi. And he got 2 octopi, which we then put in a big mayonnaise jar and drove back to San Francisco, only one of whom made it, unfortunately. But I lived with Ichabod Clancy for about a year. That's a good octopus name, don't you think? It kind of Ichabod Clancy octopus. It's got a nice rhythm to it. And my mother, the saint, every week I would go to Ocean Beach, which is the beach in San Francisco by the water, and I would collect these crabs that were like, the size of a dollar coin, and I would put them in a jar and I would leave them alive in the refrigerator. And my mom lived with that for a year. You'd open the refrigerator and there would be these crabs clicking on the glass. I know you're thinking, well, it's pretty gross. And then every day I would take a crab and I would drop it in the water, and Ichabod would float over it and roll up its arm and then tap it on the back. Crabs have an unfortunate reflex, which is when they're tapped on the back, they put their claws up to defend themselves. That's normally a good move, except if it's an octopus, because that gets the claws out of the way, and then Ichabod would land on it and inject it with something that turned it into liquid, and then would crawl under where the bubbles were shooting out of the filter and would let the bubbles tickle its tentacles while it sat there bobbing up and down and munching on crab. One other thing you should know about octopi, for those of you who've never watched the movie My Teacher, the Octopus, which you should if you haven't seen it, is octopi have, thank God we don't have this trait, octopi show their feelings by the texture and color of their skin. Can you imagine how awkward that would be in Kiddush? So if an octopus is scared, it turns smooth and white with black rings around its eyes. And if it is angry, it gets bumpy and flashes all kinds of red. And if it's happy, it turns a kind of mottled brown. And octopi are very smart. So every day I would go into the garage to spend time with Ichabod, and Ichabod would turn mottled brown if I was alone. And if I was with someone else, then either he would get really mad or he'd get really scared. Sometimes he'd ink. Okay. This I tell you to give you my credentials about science and religion, which is I've been interested for a long time because I've always been a kid who wants to know why. And how does that work? And why is that so? Right? And those people often are really nudniks that you try to avoid at social gatherings, but they either become philosophers or rabbis, one of the two. And what I want to think about is, how do science and religion connect? Because in my case, they both come out of wonder at the world that I find myself in. We live in an amazing world. I'll give you just one example that may not have occurred to you. You realize that the sun and the moon are radically different in size, right? You all know that. Sun is vastly bigger than the moon. But the distance of the sun from the earth and the distance of the moon from the earth means that from where we're standing, they're exactly the same size. So the moon can blot out the sun. Do you realize the odds against that? Like, that's extraordinary. And the world is full of all of those things that just happen to be so, that are amazing. So what is science? Science, I tell my students, is the most successful research method ever developed by human beings. There has never been as successful a way of investigating the world and making determinations as the scientific method. Just to give you one, for instance, I was able to get on a metal tube yesterday, and I was able to fling myself through the air at 35,000 feet to be here. In the history of humanity, that would be magic. That would be amazing. And yet we take it for granted that you can do that. We take it for granted so much so that at 35,000 feet, if the internet isn't quick, we start complaining. Why isn't my email working? Because you're in a tube 35,000 feet in the air, not connected to anything. That's why. So this method, though, and here comes the first debate. This research method is the unsurpassed method for exploring anything that is public, replicable, and testable. Let me say a word about each of those. Public, replicable, and testable. It has to be public because you have to be able to poke it and you have to be able to ask a question that reveals something about it. If it's purely private, then science doesn't have a way of investigating it, which is why consciousness is such a problem for science, right? Because consciousness is private. I don't know that when you say the word red, you mean what I mean by red. I know what I see when I call something red. For all I know, what you perceive is different than me. And I'm pretty sure that what Ichabod saw is different than what I see. So it has to be public for science to be able to weigh in on it. Something that is inaccessible to the public is inaccessible to science by definition. Second, it has to be replicable. Why? Because if it only happens once, then you can never be sure about causality or its own nature, right? We make assumptions of cause and effect because we keep seeing things happen again and again and again. We often make erroneous assumptions about cause and effect, but if it happens often enough, then you can test it. You can come up with an experiment in which you mess with what the cause is, and then you see if that changes the outcome. So science has to have it happen more than once, which means, for example, that the things in the universe, science can weigh in on. But the universe as a whole, the entire cosmos, science can only make guesses about. So I will share with you one of the biggest scientific whoppers of a guess. There are scientists who believe that we live in a singularity, a one big space-time bubble. But there are scientists who embrace a theory called multiverse, in which there are an infinite number of space-time bubbles. Do you know what the empirical evidence for those millions of other space-time bubbles is? There isn't any. By definition, there can't be. You can never get outside of your own space-time bubble to check if there are an infinite number of space-time bubbles. So this is a fairly extravagant theory, particularly if you want to say you should only theorize about that which you have evidence. Now, I want to say another thing. Just because it's a theory that has no evidence doesn't mean it's wrong. Lots of theories start off without evidence, right? The curvature of space, the bending of light because of gravity, for example, one of Einstein's whopper claims, turns out to be true, and it took 80 years to get the evidence to find it. But the difference between that and multiverse is, in theory, there was a way in Einstein's time to get the evidence that would prove or disprove the theory. The theory of the multiverse, by definition, can never be verified or falsified, ever, which means it's always an evidence-less hypothesis, which could be right. I mean, it's just as evidence-less to say, no, this is the only one, although we do have experience of this one, so we can at least agree that there is not less than one space-time bubble. Okay, so it has to be public, has to be replicable, because you have to have at least two of them to be able to do a comparison. And then it has to be testable. You have to be able to come up with a way of trying to prove or disprove your hypothesis about the phenomenon. Now, here's a place. Okay, so I just want to say one other thing then, and then I'm going to show you why that's a problem. Anything that is public, replicable, and testable, I want to submit to you, is best explored by using the scientific method, right? Unequaled. But here's something that is not public and replicable and testable. Listen carefully. everything that exists is public, replicable, and testable. Is that, I'm not asking whether you believe that or not. A lot of scientists do believe that, but what I want to ask you is the claim that everything that exists is public, replicable, and testable, is that claim public, replicable, and testable? It's not, which means that when a scientist in a white coat says in their most authoritative voice, if it's not public and replicable and testable, it's not real, they're talking like a human being and not like a scientist. And like any other human being, they're perfectly welcome to have unverified opinions. I, as a rabbi, am chock full of unverified opinions. But it's just their opinion. No matter how many PhDs in physics or astrophysics or cosmogony or biology, it's just their opinion, because if science is about the replicable, public, and testable, then they have no idea whether there are things that aren't. But here's what I want to tell you as a human being. We all live our lives in the non-replicable, non-testable part of the universe, right? We fall in love. Do we do an experiment to verify whether or not that's an appropriate thing to do with that individual? Thank God we don't, right? We choose careers, right? At an obscenely young age, we say, I want to be a rabbi, having no idea what that's going to feel like when they're 65. Just speaking out of personal experience here, right? We make a leap. I think I'd like to live in this community. I'd like to try that hobby. We do that all the time. And so the question I want to ask you is, do you think those things are real? Do you think they're real and significant? Things like love or trust or faith or loyalty, which are not replicable, testable, public. I would say yes. So when I talk about science, I don't mean a method for uncovering everything. I think there are a lot of things that science can help us find out. And there are also an awful lot of very important things that science is just as guessing in the dark as the rest of us. And for those things that are not susceptible to testing, that are not public, that are not replicable, for that we use other things. Math, for example, helps us to understand things about reality that are not accessible to empirical science. Myth helps us to know things about the human condition that are not susceptible to science. Meditation, prayer, open up things and insights and experiences that are otherwise closed to us. Metaphor opens, notice all these M's that I'm giving you, so it's easy to remember, right? Metaphor is a way to be able to say things about the world that are really profound, but are not empirical. So we have to have something to hold that part of reality. And to my mind, that's what religion does. Religion is that approach to the world which focuses not on what is the proper purview of science. Religion is a response to life's mysteries and wonders and marvels and terrors. And it's communal in nature. As opposed to just whether you're spiritual or not, religion is what we do with each other. And we even do it with each other when we're alone in a room. If you light Shabbat candles all by yourself, you know as well as I do that all of your loved ones are around you at that moment, including the ones who are no longer with us. You know that you are standing with our people in their entirety every time you hold up a Kiddush cup, even if you're all alone. Right? Religion is by nature communal, and it works through myth and ritual and ceremony and song and belief and identity and community. All of those things. There was a professor, Ian Barber, who famously established that there are 4 possible relationships between science and religion. The first of those is conflict. If you believe that science is the only way to know the truth about everything that exists, then you are going to think that religion is nonsense. And if you believe that religion alleviates from you the obligation to get an education, because you just need to pray on it, or open the Bible randomly to whatever page it opens to, and then point your finger at a verse, and there's your answer, well, then you're going to think that science is a waste of time. You probably also think that theater and literature and medicine are a waste of time too, which means your problem will be solved relatively quickly. But for the fundamentalists on the science side and the fundamentalists on the religion side, they are absolutely in conflict with each other. One can only be right if the other is wrong. But it turns out, although those groups are loud, they are very loud, something, by the way, that I've never understood about the professional atheists out there, I would think that the biggest advantage to being an atheist is that you wouldn't have to think about it. Right? Like if there's no God, then good, go live your life, do other things. But to spend all day writing about religion, if you're an atheist, that always seems to me like its own kind of purgatory. Conflict. Second possible relationship, which your rabbi alluded to, is independence. Science is about this, and religion is about that, and they don't touch. So the problem is when this tries to move into that category, or this tries to weigh in on that stuff, but so long as they each stay on their side of the lane, we're okay. And what is the side of the lane? Religion is about why. Right? Not in the sense of how does it happen or how does it work? What's the meaning? And science is about how. How does it work? How did it come about this way? How does it function? And so long as we each stay in our own corner, all is good. But the problem is neither of them stay in their own corner, do they? Right? So scientists keep warning us that there's going to be a disastrous change in our climate, right? That doesn't sound to me like a how kind of conversation. That sounds like a why kind of conversation. What does it mean? What's this about? Scientists weigh in all the time with moral claims based on what they've uncovered scientifically. And you know as well as I do that religious people are constantly crossing the line and telling you how things came to be. Right? In a couple of weeks, we're going to read about the sea splitting and us being led out of Egypt after 10 calamitous plagues. I don't find much comfort in the independence thing because I think that facts are value-laden. And I also think that values are factually informed. So I think that it's a waste of time to try to keep them independent. I think that that doesn't work in either direction, which then leads to the next one, which is dialogue. Okay, they're both separate, but they should be talking to each other all the time. Right? Religion has important things to say to science, and science has important things to say to religion, and they both function like traffic cops for the other. Right? Every now and then a scientist can tell a religious person, no, 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 you can't say that. That's not right. Right? And every now and then a religious person can say, are you kidding? That's grossly immoral. Right? So they tell us we got evolution wrong, and we tell them not to defoliate Southeast Asia with Agent Orange. I don't think that's really a fair swap, but that's the dialogue for you. I can live with dialogue, but my soul is all about integration. I believe that we live in a universe. So there are multiple ways to uncover aspects of that universe, but they have to ultimately be compatible. They have to ultimately be mutually supportive, which means religion is one way of looking at the world and expressing wonder and marvel and of connecting to it. And science is a parallel way of looking at the universe and expressing marvel and belonging, but they're not in conflict. And if they are in conflict, it's because you're doing one of them or possibly both of them wrong. So let me give you some examples of that integration approach. 100 years ago, the most competent scientists would tell you that there was only one universe, and it was about as big as our solar system and our visible cosmos. We now know that that is grossly understating the case, that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies the size of our galaxy. The better our telescopes go, the more we find. And the further out we go, there they are. Now, the amazing thing about those high-powered telescopes is that they are actually looking into the past, right? You're not seeing the night sky the way it is today. That night sky won't get here for 100 billion years, right? You're just seeing now what it looked like when that light left there and finally got here. Isn't that kind of wild, right? But what it does is it changes our understanding of the world. Our ancestors used to think that there was the Earth in the middle, and then there were the planets revolving around the Earth, and then there was the sun that would go up in the sky, and then at night would crawl under the Earth to get back in place again. And so that vision of the world is one in which the world is physically central. And therefore, human belonging is because we like to tell ourselves, a unique species on this planet. I will tell you that when I talk to Molly, who's my dog, about this, I tell her that if she knew us as I know us, she would realize we are much less impressive than she thinks we are. But what if science gives us a different way to express our centrality? It turns out we are living in the middle of time. I mean, chronologically, right? The universe is about as old now as it is from here to when whatever happens, happens. And maybe our centrality is you have to be living in the chronological center of time to have enough time to develop a complex conscious life form such as ours. We live in a middle planet, which is a middle distance from its sun. I've already alluded to one of the unique miracles about the Earth, which is the moon. Were it not for the moon, there would be no complicated life on this planet. The moon stabilizes the wobbling of our planet and allows for enough constancy for there to be unimpeded evolution. We also live in a planet in which the center is churning and coming to the surface. Many planets don't do that. And if we were on a planet that churned a little more, we would be living on a volcano all the time. That wouldn't work. Or if we lived on a planet that churned less, then it would be freezingly cold and we would not be here. In so many ways, the universe we live in is that what Rambam called derech habenoni, that sweet zone in the middle that makes the evolution of complex life possible. Here's an interesting thing about evolution. Evolution, say the evolutionary theorists, is purposeless, but it looks purposeful. What do you do with the fact that the Earth has evolved brain 5 times? 5 separate emergences of brain. I'm not saying a brain that came from another brain. Human brains don't count. That's a monkey brain. But bees developed brains along a separate line, as did dolphins along separate lines. What do you do with the fact that brains keep emerging. It's as if life on this planet keeps wanting to erupt in brain. Isn't that amazing? Right? There's a way in which this planet leans into more engaged life, more relatable life. Is that a fact or is that a value? I think it's both, isn't it? Science fills me with wonder because it turns out I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't believe there are two categories of stuff. Some of it is physical, some of it is spiritual. The spiritual lasts forever, the physical doesn't. I don't believe either of those are true on either side. We know that physical things are never created nor destroyed, they're just recycled, right? And I don't see the need for a separate spiritual world because the universe is, in the beautiful words of Sally McFaig, a great theologian, Christian, she wrote a book called Super, Natural, ! Which is to say, nature is so much more wondrous than we ever let ourselves know. So I'm constantly awash in that. Let me give you another example. When I was a teenager and I thought I was going to become a biologist, because I told you I like science a lot, I would take books about animal behavior. They had college textbooks in my high school library, and I would read them. And every single biologist who wrote the books on animal behavior would say, you're not supposed to project human emotions on your animal. That's illegitimate. And I remember as a 15-year-old thinking, whoever wrote this book has never lived with a dog, a cat, or a horse, not to mention an octopus, right? Because I'll tell you this about, I'll tell you a dog story. Maybe I'll tell you a horse story. Oliver was a Maltese poodle who I grew up with. She was a wonderful dog, as dogs always are. By the way, you have to say wonderful with a person because a lot of them are not, but you've kind of covered it with dog once you say dog. So she had really long hair, and every now and then she would get outside, and we lived right near the Presidio, which was an army base in San Francisco, and she would get in there, and there were these nettles that would get burrowed into her hair, and then you have to take the dog to the vet, and they shave her off clean. And Oliver would come home, and she would go right under my mother's king-size bed, and she would not come out for 4 days, which is exactly what you would do if someone, against your will, shaved off all of your hair and then made you walk back in front of a room of people who loved you. I knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. Ridiculous. She also, and there are many good reasons for this, she hated men. Honestly, that's easy to do if you pay attention to them. She hated men. And, but she loved me, and she loved my father, who no longer lived with us because my parents were divorced. So that was also a way of aggravating my mother. But she loved the two of us while hating men as a class. As she got older, she wasn't able to see so good. So I would come home, and she would hear a man approaching the house, and she would go bursting out of the house, barking until she got close enough to say, oh, it's him. And then what she would do to cover it up is she would run past me barking into the middle of the street. And then she would turn around and kind of say, I knew it was you all along. I was barking at him. It was obvious what the dog was doing. Well, it turns out 30 years later, if you pick up an animal behavior textbook now what they say is that, of course, animals have similar emotions to your emotions. They may think of it differently than you do, but the emotions are the same because where do you think you got yours from? Turns out Maimonides said that too. Maimonides in the medieval period said that cows and human mothers have the same feelings about their young. Isn't that amazing? He knew that because he lived with cows, right? If you just pay attention, you would know that. But pet emotions fills me with wonder too. Have you ever thought about the fact that dogs are the only animals that if you point, don't look at your hand? If you point for a fox or a horse or a cow, they look at your hand, right? The dog looks where you're pointing, which means that dogs and people have evolved together in a way that they know when we grimace with our teeth, we're doing the equivalent of when they wag their butt. And when they wag their butt, we act like they're smiling. We read each other. That's miraculous, isn't it? Really, if you think about that, these two species that kind of hitch their wagons to each other and have made common cause and are doing pretty well. Okay, so that's one example of where science makes me more spiritual, because I just see all around me examples of life and the world being far more magnificent than we let ourselves know. It's not a big dead machine. But let me tell you my other favorite example, and then we'll close and we can talk about this a bit. There is a creature known as slime mold. Slime mold is a single-celled colonial organism. I don't mean colonial in the political sense. I mean they like to hang out with each other, right? So there was a professor in Japan who did a really fascinating experiment with slime mold. He took a glass plate and he put chicken broth on the glass plate. Apparently, slime mold, like Jews, really like chicken soup. And then he put a colony of slime mold in the middle, and he cranked the temperature so the room was toasty warm. And the slime molds start to expand to maximize their exposure to the food. And then on the count of 30 minutes, he turned the room freezing. And the slime mold constrict, and they do that to try to retain heat. After 5 minutes, he turned the heat back up to hot again, and over time, the slime molds start to expand again, and on the count of 30, boom, back to freezing. By the fourth cycle, do you know what the slime mold did at 29 minutes? Constricted. Now, this is a creature that doesn't have neurology. This is a creature that doesn't have brains. But if a person did that, you would say that they were anticipating, that's a film reference for those of you who catch it, Rocky Horror Picture Show. They are anticipating what's coming. But how do they do that? They don't have brains. They don't have nerves. Well, it turns out, you may know this from some of your relatives, you can do an awful lot of things in the world without a brain. Because a mind is not the same thing as a brain. The universe, I believe, is awash in mind, in mindfulness. Mammals access mind through brain. Although it turns out even people, their processing of the world is not limited to their cranium. We all talk about a gut reaction. Turns out that's not a metaphor. We have a lot of nerves in our gut system, and we do a lot of our perceiving not in our cranium. But it turns out a lot of living things express mindfulness without using neurons at all. Plants have the ability to communicate content to each other. If you light a match under the leaf of a plant, the other plants will know it and will respond, because that plant will release a pheromone that will tell the other plants to thicken their outer skin layer, right? Plants talk to each other. They just don't talk with mouths. They don't use air in their throats, but they are communicating content to each other just as we do, right? So slime mold for me, by the way, slime mold can be useful for subway systems. If you want to find out the most efficient way to get from point A to point B, you make a grid and a maze, and then you put food at the beginning and food at the end, and you put the slime mold at the beginning, and it'll take the slime mold 25 minutes to give you the most efficient way to get from point A to point B. It's astonishing. So So what if we live in a universe that is awash in the wonders? It's just far more magnificent than we let ourselves know. And if we buy into bad metaphysics, the world is just dead matter, then we can't explain consciousness, we can't explain mindfulness, we can't explain the universe, and we deaden ourselves to what we don't think we're allowed to see. But we see it every day, right? So what if we break down the barrier? What if we realize that science is an essential road to be able to know how much there is to appreciate? Which it is. We live in miraculous times. And I mean that on two levels. I, in the last 5 years, have had 3 cancers, right? I had a melanoma. I had prostate cancer. Thank God I had the prostate cancer, because doing the body scan for that revealed the thyroid cancer, which was symptomless. 3 cancers. I would be dead. I'm here talking to you because of the miracles of science, right? And I'm very grateful for those miracles. But I'm also grateful. I mean, one other thing, just to tell you, at our age, we learn human anatomy by what breaks. But we also, in addition to extending our lives in ways our ancestors could never have imagined, we're able to see things that our ancestors could never see. Just go on YouTube and you can see the most extraordinary, amazing things that happen in nature all the time. We just weren't looking. So what if we break the wall down between the two? And we understand that science feeds us the information to be able to then cherish this fragile, beautiful planet we're on, to be able to see the miracles that we otherwise won't see. And religion gives us the power to say thank you, to be able to take our gratitude and share it, to be able to hold each other through difficult moments and dance together during the happy times. There is a resiliency to spirit that isn't going to go away. And I would argue, and I think most Jews already know that science is not only not a competitor to that spirit, but an active source that feeds our sense of marvel and wonder, but we need to have a way to say thanks. Shabbat shalom.
You want to take a couple of questions?
I do. I want to take a couple of questions or hear short speeches or whatever you want to do. Yeah.
I don't know how to frame the question exactly, but it just goes to the existence of God. And some people just find comfort in not believing that there's a God. And other people find comfort in believing there is a God. And they use what you were talking about as their proof that there isn't, or the inability, and who has the burden of proof in this discussion.
Right. So part of what I'm arguing against, there are plenty of materialist reductionists, people who think the only thing that exists is physical stuff, and that you explain it by breaking it down to its simplest components. As if you could ever explain Beethoven's Ninth Symphony by describing the sound waves. Right. But those people would say the burden of proof is on people who want to talk about the supernatural. I'm rejecting that. I want to say to you, everybody walks around with unverified claims. There's no way to be alive and not walk around with unverified assumptions, because a lot of what we think of know about the world isn't provable or disprovable. You cannot prove the existence of God, stop trying. You cannot disprove the existence of God, please stop trying, right? So our response should be one of curiosity and compassion. I have no desire as a rabbi to make someone believe in God. And I have no need, this is a heresy, to make someone want to be Jewish. right? There are plenty of people who have been so wounded by their religious upbringing that the healthiest thing they can do for themselves is walk away. My job isn't to force them into a toxic place for them. My job is to help them stand in the light. And if the light that they find is in a place other than where I find it, that's still my job. So I know for me, I went from atheist to someone who loves God, and I see God in my life all over the place. And I'm happy to schmooze with whoever wants to hear about that. And I'm happy for people who are drawn to make a similar journey. But I am not interested in coercing or converting anyone who doesn't want to be. Let him be.
So that's more what you do.
Tell us about your journey.
Okay. So I grew up in a very politically progressive household. When I was 7, my mother took me to march against the Vietnam War and to march for Eugene McCarthy when he was a liberal. I remember, by the way, one thing my mother has taught me that I never forgot. She made us carry American flags because she said, they don't own the flag, we do. And I think that's a beautiful statement of patriotism. Years ago, a synagogue I used to be a member of had an aliyah the weekend after July 4th for those people who got a flag to put up at their home. And I shouted out, what about the people who didn't have to get a flag? So I grew up in a very progressive household in San Francisco, very anti-religious. And in college, I had 2 Christian roommates who were the best Christians since the first. They were so kind, so beautiful as human beings. And I had always grown up where religion was a synonym for dumb, of which there's a lot of evidence. But one of these roommates, Peter, has gone on to get an MD and a PhD in computer science and is on the faculty at Johns Hopkins. So you can say many things about him, I suppose, but dumb is not on the list. And at Harvard, I met people who were religious and not dumb. And the problem I had always had with my atheism was, like my mother, I have a keen sense of right or wrong. I don't believe it's subjective. I don't believe it's subject to a vote. I think that there are just some lines you don't cross, no matter what your culture tells you. And there was no way to justify that without a God. So Peter made me start thinking about maybe there's a God, and I could never believe the story he believed. It's a whopper, you know, guy gets buried in a tomb, 7 days later, the tomb is empty. I mean, I won't even tell you that story. It's wild. Right? You might have encountered it. But I was interested in thinking about God, so I went to talk to the Hillel rabbi, who was a Rabbi Ben Zion Gold, who was himself a Holocaust survivor and a great, great idiosyncratic man. And he said, there's no argument that you can make for this. The only way to explore it is to try it. So try being a believer and see if it works for you. So he did 2 things. He said, you have to come to synagogue for 2 months every Shabbat, because the first month you're going to spend the whole time saying, do I stand? Do I sit? Where do I go to sit? Why are they shuffling backwards now? Why are they stepping forward now? Like, you need to go there enough so that you know the melodies and you don't have to guess about the choreography anymore. And you have, this is my seat. 2 months, he said, that'll do it. And then he gave me a book to read by Franz Rosenzweig, who was a German Jewish existential thinker who himself had grown up in a very assimilated Jewish household and then came back to Judaism in a beautiful way. And I fell in love. And it may have been biological. The same semester that I fell in love with God was when I met Ilana. And 40 years later, I'm with the same woman and the same God. So it may well have just been hormones. I don't know. But apparently I'm a one-woman man and a one-God man. And so I have been growing in love with both of them ever since. At the time, I planned to be a politician. I was president of the Harvard Democratic Club. I volunteered for the ACLU in Boston State House. I was an intern for U.S. Senator Alan Cranston. I was an intern, LBJ intern in Congress for Congressman Burton. And then I got a job as a volunteer with the assembly member from San Francisco, a man named Willie Brown. And Willie became Speaker of the Assembly. And so he offered to pay me retroactively for the summer and to hire me for when I graduated. So I went back my final year in school knowing what I was going to be doing after that. And I planned to move to the district, San Francisco, and start building a base and run for office. But at the time, I told myself that my growing love for Judaism was such that after a glorious career in politics, I would one day retire from the Senate and go to rabbinical school for the learning. And I mentioned that to my then fiance, and she said, "That's stupid," which is how she often delivers her wisdom to me. I will just tell those of you who are married to similar people, it is not their cutest trait. And the fact that they're almost always right doesn't help. So that's stupid, she said. If you want to do that, you don't know what life is going to bring. You should do that now. And that was the first time it occurred to me that it's not that you're born a rabbi, you can choose to become one. It hadn't occurred to me. So I spent a week at taxpayers' expense writing an application to rabbinical school. Did 5 years in rabbinical school, and then I took a pulpit in Southern California, was there for 10 years. The shul grew from 200 to 600 families. 15 people during that time went from that congregation to rabbinical school. So I will just tell you the 200 people converted to Judaism in my intro program. So I do want to remind you the demographic problems are not my fault. And then the dean of this new rabbinical school in LA made Aliyah, and I got a call from the president of the university, and he said, "Would you like to become the dean?" And I thought, and I think, that if you're ever made such an offer, there's only one answer, which is, of course, I want to do that. And so I have been deaning for about 25 years, and there are about 200-300 rabbis out in the world who've had to put up with me. And I still am inspired by my students and by my former students when I see the genius and the compassion that they bring to their work. That just makes me think that that was a really good career choice. So that's my story.
I'll give you an update on Ichabod. You know, when you go to New York, we started at Occupy Wall Street. Genius. I've heard genius. I was so proud. It's a wonderful. Thank you to Rabbi Artson for bringing California weather here at Harvard. We have we're gonna all take a rest, and we're gonna resume here at 6:30. Do I remember that right, Jerry? 6:30. Please come to mitzvah. We don't often, except for bar mitzvah and read mitzvah affirmations, which we commonly do in that afternoon. But we don't often just get together without an affirmation for Shabbat afternoon. So I look forward to seeing you at 6:30 for a beautiful mitzvah and a reception. And then just because Rabbi Artson just loves to shirk the difficult topics, I've asked him to speak tonight on Israel. We look forward to this person. Shabbat shalom.